Welcome back to another episode of Out Loud Geek, where we discuss news and views about pop culture, science fiction, fantasy, food, cooking, the outdoors, and more. I'm going to forewarn you now that this is a long video, but I hope that you'll watch it because if you are a fan of Star Wars, then the information that I'm about to provide you may help you to better understand the current state of Lucasfilm and the franchise itself a little better. Nearly a month ago, on October 3rd, 2024, The Hollywood Reporter released an article entitled, "Is Disney Bad at Star Wars? An Analysis." But as you might expect, the article's author, James Hibbard, decided at the article's conclusion that Disney isn't because this is a Hollywood trade, which means that they're going to present their information and derive conclusions in their own very biased manner, which includes elements of unsubstantiated hearsay, in order to maintain their pro-Hollywood and pro-Disney slant at all costs. After all, like the shill access media, The Hollywood Reporter doesn't want to upset its inside sources of information. But as someone who provides a consumer's perspective, I decided to examine this question myself by looking at the facts, and to then allow the facts to speak for themselves, which is something that Hollywood clearly prefers not to do. So in this video, I'm only going to cover the 5 Star Wars movies that Disney and Lucasfilm, under Kathleen Kennedy's leadership, have released up to this point in time. I plan to cover the Star Wars streaming shows on Disney Plus in a separate video in the near future. But before proceeding, I'd like to ask everyone to please like this video, please leave a comment, please subscribe to support this channel, and please press the bell to receive notifications. Thanks! Under Disney's, and in my own opinion, regrettable ownership of Lucasfilm and the Star Wars franchise, which began in late 2012, the first Star Wars productions that Lucasfilm released under Disney's banner were movies. Their first Star Wars TV series that streamed on Disney Plus didn't premiere until about a month before the premiere of their 5th and most recent Star Wars movie in December of 2019. To gauge each movie's degree of success or failure, as the case may be, we'll look at each one from 2 different intertwined perspectives. The first perspective is each movie's box office performance, which includes a set of quantitative measurements that are purely objective in manner. But the second perspective is a subjective view of each movie's narrative content, but will include statistical data in terms of average audience scores from aggregator websites. And the reason that we need to view each movie from these 2 very different perspectives is because they are not mutually exclusive. The worse that an audience views a particular movie, the worse that movie's box office is likely going to be. And the reverse is also very likely true, but there is no quantitative way to accurately determine how an audience's subjective view of a movie might impact its box office earnings. Audience expectations that precede a movie's theatrical release are also not mutually exclusive from its eventual box office performance because, again, the former definitely impacts the latter, but in a manner that cannot be quantitatively determined. And the 5 movies that we'll be examining in this video are as follows: 2015's Star Wars VII: The Force Awakens, 2016's Rogue One: A Star Wars Story, 2017's Star Wars VIII: The Last Jedi, 2018's Solo: A Star Wars Story, and 2019's Star Wars IX: The Rise of Palpatine. So beginning the analysis with 2015's Star Wars VII: The Force Awakens, it was released 3 years after Disney's CEO Bob Iger purchased Lucasfilm and the Star Wars franchise from George Lucas. It was directed by Jar Jar Abrams and written by Jar Jar Abrams, Lawrence Kasdan, and Michael Arndt. And the reason that Michael Arndt received any writing credits at all for this movie is because a small amount of his original sequel trilogy script ideas that he was working on before George Lucas sold Lucasfilm and Star Wars to Disney might have gotten into Disney's final product. Lawrence Kasdan is a veteran Lucas Star Wars writer who has writing credits for both Star Wars V: The Empire Strikes Back and Star Wars VI: Return of the Jedi. His inclusion in Disney's first foray into creating a Star Wars movie not only added to its credibility, there's an interesting metric that I will be sharing later in the video about this. But Jar Jar Abrams, who is best known for his overuse of his so-called mystery boxes, as well as lens flares, was the principal writer. And Abrams' plan was to essentially create a remake of George Lucas's original 1977 movie Star Wars IV: A New Hope, with a few narrative changes thrown in to make it appear sufficiently different from the original so that it wouldn't be as obvious that it was just a remake. But in my own personal view, The Force Awakens was not an original movie. I view it as being nothing more than a hacked remake. I'm also going to point out that when Lucas agreed to sell Lucasfilm and the Star Wars franchise to Disney in late 2012, he was under the impression from Bob Iger that Disney was going to produce a sequel trilogy based on outlines that he had written himself and given to Iger. But that was not what Disney or Kathleen Kennedy did, and George Lucas was not happy about that. Iger even talks about this in his autobiography, claiming that Lucas misunderstood what he had told him. But when The Force Awakens premiered in December 2015, longtime Star Wars fans, who were craving for more Star Wars, and normies alike, flocked to theaters in massive numbers to make it the highest-grossing movie of the entire franchise of all time, which is a record that The Force Awakens still holds to this day. And I don't expect that to ever change for the foreseeable future. But here's our first set of quantitative data that's for this movie. With a production budget of $447 million, as reported by Forbes, the movie earned a domestic opening weekend box office of nearly $248 million, a final domestic box office total of $936.7 million, and a final global gross box office total of $2,071.3 million. And for those of you who have watched any of my weekly box office roundup videos, you'll probably remember that I typically multiply a movie's production budget by 2.5 and 3.0 to estimate its break-even point range by taking the movie's marketing and other miscellaneous costs into account, as well as the fact that movie theaters typically keep 50% of the gross box office ticket sales for themselves. But for this video, I am instead going to estimate the movie's total cost by multiplying its production budget by 1.25 and 1.5 to account for the marketing and other miscellaneous costs, because I'm going to handle Disney's and Lucasfilm's net earnings from the global gross box office ticket sales a bit differently. And those multiplications yield an estimated range for the movie's total cost of around $558.8 million to $670.5 million. Then instead of simply multiplying the movie's global gross box office earnings by 50% to estimate how much Lucasfilm and Disney netted, I'm only going to multiply the gross domestic box office earnings by 50%. Then I'm going to multiply the gross international box office earnings by 40% because international movie theaters typically keep a higher percentage of the gross box office ticket sales for themselves than domestic ones. So by applying 50% domestic and 40% international percentages on the movie's global gross box office ticket sales, that yields an estimated net earnings for Disney and Lucasfilm of around $922.2 million, which is less than half of its global gross box office ticket sales. And when we subtract the estimated range of total costs from Disney and Lucasfilm's estimated net earnings, we get a range of possible profit for The Force Awakens of around $251.7 million to $363.5 million. So while The Force Awakens was a huge box office success for Disney and Kathleen Kennedy, it also set the stage for very high audience expectations for the subsequent movies that followed. And that was a very precarious place that they put themselves into. Disney and Kathleen Kennedy more than likely assumed that after the massive success of The Force Awakens, that they could pretty much do anything that they wanted and fans would just eat it up. But nothing could be further from the truth, because in spite of the movie's box office success, it wasn't actually without its narrative flaws that became increasingly apparent over time. Over on IMDb, The Force Awakens has an audience score of 7.8, but on Metacritic it's a lot lower at 6.6. And a few of this movie's more notable narrative flaws include the following. First, Mark Hamill's incredibly beloved character of Luke Skywalker that was introduced in George Lucas's original trilogy only made an incredibly brief appearance at the very end of the movie and had no spoken lines. Second, while Carrie Fisher's character of Princess Leia and Harrison Ford's character of Han Solo were briefly shown together on screen, at no point over the course of this first sequel trilogy movie were all three of these beloved characters, Luke, Leia, and Han, ever shown together on screen. And that was a huge mistake in terms of both fan service and fan expectations, especially since Ford's character of Han Solo died in the movie, and actress Carrie Fisher died in 2016. Third, by occurring 30 years after the events of Star Wars VI: Return of the Jedi, none of Luke Skywalker's efforts to rebuild the Jedi Order, or the relationship between Leia and Han, were ever really explored to any reasonable degree. These were just past off-screen events that Jar Jar Abrams and later Rian Johnson essentially glossed over with very few details. The result was a serious lack of world building as compared with George Lucas's 6 Star Wars movies. Fourth, Jar Jar Abrams introduced a plethora of mystery boxes into the movie, such as the unknown identities of Rey's parents, and how Maz Kanata possessed Luke's original lightsaber that had once belonged to his father Anakin and was lost in Cloud City when Darth Vader cut Luke's hand off in Star Wars V: The Empire Strikes Back. That latter mystery box was never answered by any sequel trilogy movie, but the former had contradictory answers provided in the succeeding sequel trilogy movies by Rian Johnson first, then by Jar Jar Abrams later. And the fifth and last narrative issue that I will mention here is Leia and Rey hugging each other after Han Solo's death, as if they had always known each other when they had never previously met prior to that moment. That scene made absolutely no sense then, and still doesn't nearly 9 years later. But in spite of these and several other narrative issues in The Force Awakens, the movie created huge fan expectations for the next sequel trilogy movie. But let's move on to Disney's next Lucasfilm Star Wars movie that was released in 2016 as a standalone movie entitled Rogue One: A Star Wars Story, whose plot centered around how the Rebels had obtained the plans for the original Death Star as an immediate prequel of sorts to George Lucas's original Star Wars IV: A New Hope. Directed by Gareth Edwards, it was written by Chris Weitz, Tony Gilroy, and John Knoll. And the latter, John Knoll, does have previous Star Wars credentials in terms of supervising the special effects for George Lucas's prequel trilogy movies: Star Wars I: The Phantom Menace, Star Wars II: Attack of the Clones, and Star Wars III: Revenge of the Sith. With a production budget of $232.4 million, as reported by Forbes, the movie earned a domestic opening weekend box office of nearly $155.1 million, a final domestic box office total of $533.5 million, and a final global gross box office total of $1,055.1 million. So again, by multiplying the production budget by 1.25 and 1.5, that yields an estimated range of total costs for the movie of $290.5 million to $348.6 million. And by using the same 50% domestic and 40% international percentages for how much Disney's and Lucasfilm's net earnings were from the movie's global gross box office ticket sales, that yields an estimated net earnings of $475.4 million. And when we subtract the range of estimated total costs from the movie's estimated net earnings, we get a range of $126.8 million to $184.9 million in estimated profit, which makes Rogue One another financial win for Disney and Kathleen Kennedy. But it was also around a 49% decline in profitability, with a range of plus or minus 9.5% as compared with the profits that The Force Awakens earned in 2015. Subjectively, on IMDb, Rogue One, similar to The Force Awakens, also has an audience score of 7.8, but on Metacritic it's a lot higher than The Force Awakens at 7.6, which is more in line with IMDb. Of all Disney Star Wars movies, today, Rogue One is the only one of the 5 that I will still actually watch. But now let's move on to the next sequel trilogy movie that was released in 2017. The very disjointed, incongruous, divisive, and now mostly despised movie Star Wars VIII: The Last Jedi, which was both solely written and directed by Rian Johnson, who boasted that he was going to subvert fans' expectations. And guess what? He succeeded, but in more ways than he had probably intended. The Last Jedi introduced some very controversial narrative elements into the Star Wars franchise, which is part of what he meant by subverting fans' expectations. But fans and normie moviegoers alike had also expected a good and entertaining movie along the lines of the massively successful movie The Force Awakens and the moderately successful Rogue One. For many, including myself, he successfully subverted that expectation too, because like most, I can't stand The Last Jedi. As people walked out of the movie theater in 2015 after watching The Force Awakens on opening night, I watched people hooping and hollering because of how much they loved the movie. But in stark contrast, when people were walking out of the movie theater where I watched The Last Jedi on opening night 2 years later, no one was saying a word. They were all in stunned silence, which is something that I will never forget. That, in plain view for all to see that night, was the result of Rian Johnson subverting everyone's expectations. And let me now point out a very important distinction between The Last Jedi and the previous 2 Disney Star Wars movies. Each of the previous 2 movies had a writer that was a veteran who had worked on George Lucas's Star Wars movies long before he sold Lucasfilm and Star Wars to Disney. But that wasn't the case with The Last Jedi. It was solely written by Rian Johnson, who had no prior experience with Star Wars, and which made it Disney's, Lucasfilm's, and Kathleen Kennedy's first fully Lucas-free Star Wars movie. So it isn't just coincidental that The Last Jedi was also the first, but by no means the last, Disney Star Wars movie to have serious narrative flaws, far more than The Force Awakens or Rogue One. With a production budget of $300 million, as reported by Forbes, the movie earned a domestic opening weekend box office of nearly $220 million, a final domestic box office total of $620.2 million, and a final global gross box office total of $1,334.4 million. Again, by multiplying the production budget by 1.25 and 1.5, that yields an estimated range of total costs of $375 million to $450 million. And using the same 50% domestic and 40% international percentages for how much Disney's and Lucasfilm's net earnings were from the movie's global gross box office ticket sales, that yields an estimated net earnings of $595.8 million. And when we subtract the range of estimated total costs from the estimated net earnings, we get a range of $145.8 million to $220.8 million in estimated profit. So quantitatively, The Last Jedi was another profitable win for Disney and Kathleen Kennedy, but it was also around a 40.41% decline in profitability, with a range of plus or minus 12.19% as compared with the profits that The Force Awakens earned in 2015. But thanks to its narrative content written solely by Rian Johnson, The Last Jedi was also ultimately very reputationally damaging for Disney, Lucasfilm, and Kathleen Kennedy because it told longtime Star Wars fans and normie moviegoers alike that there was then something seriously wrong with the franchise. Now, while I have no evidence to back this next statement, I do believe that The Force Awakens led many people into a false sense of security that Disney and Lucasfilm, under Kathleen Kennedy's control, knew what they were doing with the Star Wars franchise. But The Last Jedi, in all likelihood, shattered that sense of security for most, and instead probably replaced it in many with a foreboding that things were only going to become worse for the franchise. And that's exactly what happened. The franchise did get a lot worse after The Last Jedi. In other words, The Last Jedi was just the beginning of the Star Wars franchise's downfall, all thanks to Disney and Kathleen Kennedy. On IMDb, The Last Jedi has an audience score of 6.9, but on Metacritic, it's a lot lower at 4.3. And some of Ruin Johnson's poorly written and conceived franchise-subverting narrative elements in The Last Jedi that led to such low audience scores and were the most damaging to the Star Wars franchise itself include the following. The retconning of the beloved character Luke Skywalker by transforming him from the original trilogy's brave, optimistic, and self-sacrificing hero, who was always willing to help his friends and bring about the rebirth of the Jedi, into a cynical and cowardly curmudgeon who'd rather hide from his problems, abandon his friends, and reject the concepts of the Jedi and the Jedi Order itself. For many, this was an unforgivable change in the character that even Mark Hamill did not like. But for Ruin Johnson, this was one of his proudest subverted expectations. The transformation and retconning of John Boyega's reformed stormtrooper character named Finn, who had found his courage in The Force Awakens, back into a coward who only wanted to run away again, as well as being retconned from being a serious character into poorly conceived comic relief. He was then teamed up with the annoying character of Rose Tico, as played by actress Kelly Marie Tran, who then deliberately prevents him from sacrificing himself to save the Resistance once he finally finds his courage again, as he had in The Force Awakens. The eventual apparent appearance of Luke Skywalker towards the end of the movie as he seemingly challenges Adam Driver's Kylo Ren to what many thought was going to be an epic lightsaber duel, until it was revealed that Luke was just using the Force to make it appear that he was there when he physically wasn't. That in of itself was a huge audience letdown, which was another one of Ruin Johnson's proudly subverted expectations that caused far more harm than good. An answer to Jar Jar Abrams' mystery box of who Mary Sue Ray's parents were, with the revelation from Kylo Ren that they were nobodies, which was yet another one of Ruin Johnson's proudly subverted expectations for fans. And finally, the destruction of a massive First Order ship by ramming it at light speed, which totally undermined all of the previous space battles that had ever occurred in Star Wars. Ruin Johnson had also introduced a number of truly stupid narrative and cinematic elements into the movie that included the following. Space bombers dropping bombs in the weightlessness of outer space while in orbit, which makes such an action physically impossible. The use of yo mama jokes in the midst of a serious space battle, which effectively ruined the scene. Leia being blown into outer space, then using the Force to pull herself back onto the Resistance spaceship and looking like Mary Poppins in space in the process. The First Order's pointless slow chase of the Resistance ships in outer space that was reminiscent of the LAPD slow chasing O.J. Simpson in Los Angeles in 1994. The pointless bird-like creatures known as porgs that were nothing more than an attempt at product placement. Luke milking a giant sea cow-like creature, followed by him disgustingly drinking its freshly squeezed blue milk. The pointless death of Snoke by Kylo Ren. The overly choreographed battle between Rey and Kylo Ren against Snoke's Red Guards. Yoda's Force Ghost appearance to Luke, with Yoda causing an ancient tree that contained ancient Jedi manuscripts to catch on fire. The scene of Rose Tico preventing Finn from saving everyone, and her stupid line that she says about needing to win through love. And the handful of surviving Resistance fighters on board the Millennium Falcon at the end of the movie laughing with one another after most of their compatriots were killed, showing that their deaths meant absolutely nothing to them. In of itself, The Last Jedi was a huge mistake for the Star Wars franchise because its primary purpose can be summed up by a single line that Ruin Johnson wrote for Kylo Ren to say to Mary Sue Ray.
Let the past die. kill it if you have to.
The way that The Last Jedi came across, it gave the very distinct impression to many, including myself, that it was Rian Johnson's attempt to destroy everything that George Lucas had previously built, which is the core and essence of the franchise. But guess what? If you thought The Last Jedi was bad, the worst was actually yet to come. Unsurprisingly, when the next big movie came out 6 months later, the ill-fated 2018 standalone movie Solo: A Star Wars Story, it became a massive cinematic failure by being the first ever Star Wars movie to flop at the box office. And you may be surprised to learn that it's not the only one to have done so. Here I will ask the following question. Just how far does a very popular franchise have to sink before it's unable to get enough people to want to watch a newly released movie so that it would be able to break even? In my own opinion, Solo failed not only because it was a bad movie, but also because of how much damage The Last Jedi had inflicted upon the franchise and moviegoers' expectations 6 months earlier. The Last Jedi forever shattered the notion that no Star Wars movie could be bad. It could be argued that Solo: A Star Wars Story was doomed long before it premiered, thanks to all of the drama that had occurred behind the scenes when Kathleen Kennedy fired the film's original directors, Phil Lord and Chris Miller, and replaced them with Ron Howard, who then subsequently filmed a lot of reshoots. So much so that 70% of Solo: A Star Wars Story is what Ron Howard reshot, and neither Phil Lord nor Chris Miller received any directorial credits for the movie, though they both received credits as producers. This movie, which had a reported $270.8 million production budget according to Forbes, earned a domestic opening weekend box office of nearly $84.4 million, a final domestic box office total of $213.8 million, and a final global gross box office total of $393.2 million. By multiplying the production budget by 1.25 and 1.5, that yields an estimated range of total costs for the movie of around $338.5 million to $406.2 million. So the movie's production budget and total costs weren't that much lower than those for The Last Jedi, but its global gross box office earnings were 70.53% lower. Then using the same 50% domestic and 40% international percentages for how much Disney's and Lucasfilm's net earnings were on the movie's global gross box office ticket sales, that yields an estimated net earnings of around $178.6 million. Consequently, when we subtract the range of estimated total costs from the movie's estimated net earnings, we get an estimated range of losses of around $159.9 million to $227.6 million, which was also around a 163% decline with a range of plus or minus 11% as compared with the profits that The Force Awakens earned in 2015. And after the massive failure of Solo: A Star Wars Story is when Bob Iger announced that Disney and Lucasfilm were going to slow down the rate of Star Wars movie productions. To save face, he publicly blamed the film's failure on audience burnout with the franchise, without any corroborating evidence to back that claim up, because he didn't want to publicly admit that Solo: A Star Wars Story was very simply a bad movie. And guess what? Just as with The Last Jedi, no Lucas veteran Star Wars writers were involved in Solo. And what are the movie's audience scores? On IMDb, Solo: A Star Wars Story also has an audience score of 6.9, but on Metacritic it's a 6.0, which means that it has a more favorable rating than The Last Jedi. But the next movie was so bad that it stank worse than The Last Jedi, and I always describe it as a dumpster fire of a movie because, as far as I'm concerned, it effectively burned what was left of the franchise to the ground. A full 18 months would pass before the release of Disney's and Lucasfilm's third and final Star Wars sequel trilogy movie. And much like Solo: A Star Wars Story, this movie also had pre-release behind-the-scenes drama when Kathleen Kennedy fired the movie's original writer and director, Colin Trevorrow, who she replaced with none other than Jar Jar Abrams. And Abrams, who was clearly brought in to be a franchise fixer, caused even more harm to the franchise than The Last Jedi had. And instead of having at least one veteran Lucas Star Wars writer to help him co-write Episode 9, two relative novices were hired who had no prior experience writing anything related to Star Wars. Chris Terrio, whose main writing experience before Episode 9 was working on DC's 2016 movie Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, which was a truly awful movie, and 2017's Justice League, which wasn't all that good either. And Derek Connolly, whose main writing experience before Episode 9 was working on Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom, two LEGO Jurassic World TV series, and the movie Kong Skull Island. So between Jar Jar Abrams, Chris Terrio, and Derek Connolly, the result of their creative efforts was a total dumpster fire of a movie that I prefer to name as Star Wars 9: The Rise of Palpatine. Between The Last Jedi, Solo: A Star Wars Story, and The Rise of Palpatine, none of them had any Lucas Star Wars veterans as writers, and all of them were narratively flawed. And in the case of The Rise of Palpatine, it retconned the franchise more than The Last Jedi had when Jar Jar Abrams unilaterally decided that Anakin and Luke Skywalker had not jointly defeated Emperor Palpatine at the end of Episode 6's Return of the Jedi, as everyone had known for 4 decades, when Abrams took it upon himself to bring Palpatine back, alive and well, in Episode 9. This retcon was not only incredibly insulting to longtime Star Wars fans, but also to George Lucas's legacy.
The main thing is to protect these characters, make sure that they still continue to live in the way that you created them.
And has Kathleen Kennedy done that? Hell no. The decision to bring Palpatine back was truly the stupidest decision that could have possibly been made, but it actually fit perfectly well within Rian Johnson's message from The Last Jedi.
Let the past die. Kill it if you have to.
And that's only part of what this dumpster fire of a movie, The Rise of Palpatine, achieved. It completely destroyed George Lucas's characters and legacy against a backdrop of the very anticlimactic death of Princess Leia, chasing after multiple poorly designed MacGuffins, ridiculously over-empowering the Force to further retcon what it is, the use of ground vehicles with tank treads instead of using anti-gravity technology that has long been commonplace within the Star Wars universe, a ghostly appearance by Han Solo who wasn't a Jedi, space ponies galloping on top of the hulls of Star Destroyers as the giant ships were rising high above the ground, controlling 1,000 or more Star Destroyers from a single easily taken out control tower, retconning what Rian Johnson had written in The Last Jedi by deciding that Mary Sue Ray was the granddaughter of Palpatine and not the daughter of nobodies. The alleged death of Sheev Palpatine by Mary Sue Ray when they'd already brought him back from the dead for this dumpster fire of a movie, and Mary Sue Ray Palpatine calling herself Rey Skywalker in the movie's final scene. And what were this movie's audience scores? On IMDb, The Rise of Palpatine has an audience score of 6.4, which isn't just the lowest for all 5 Disney Star Wars movies, it's also lower than the 6.5 audience score that Star Wars 1: The Phantom Menace has. And on Metacritic, it's a 4.5, which is barely higher than the 4.3 audience score that The Last Jedi has. This dumpster fire of a movie had a production budget of $416.1 million, as reported by Forbes, and it earned a domestic opening weekend box office of nearly $177.4 million, a final domestic box office total of $515.2 million, and a final global gross box office total of $1,077 million. Multiplying the production budget by 1.25 and 1.5 yields an estimated range of total costs of $520.1 million to $624.2 million. And using the same 50% domestic and 40% international percentages for how much Disney's and Lucasfilm's net earnings were from the movie's global gross box office ticket sales, that yields an estimated net earnings of $482.3 million, which is less than the movie's estimated range of total costs. So when we subtract the range of estimated total costs from the movie's estimated net earnings, we get an estimated range of losses from $37.8 million to $141.8 million, which was also around a 129.2% decline, with a range of plus or minus 16.91%, as compared with the profits that The Force Awakens earned in 2015. So yes, you heard me right. The Rise of Palpatine, which grossed over $1 billion worldwide, was actually a box office flop that lost money just like Solo: A Star Wars Story did. Disney, the trades, and the shill access media websites won't talk about this fact because they don't want to admit that Kathleen Kennedy had two major Star Wars box office flops in 2018 and 2019. But in terms of whether Disney and Kathleen Kennedy are bad at Star Wars, even without taking the Disney Plus shows into account, financially they currently have 3 successes and 2 flops, but in terms of the narratives, I would say that they have 2 successes and 3 flops. And given the diminishing returns seen across all 5 Disney Star Wars movies, the narrative failures have clearly had a significant adverse impact. So as far as I'm concerned, my answer is yes, Disney and Kathleen Kennedy are bad at Star Wars. Thanks for watching today, and a huge thanks to each and every one of you who has subscribed to support this channel. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, X, and Blue Sky by clicking on the links in the description. Until next time, this is Out Loud Geek.